share your comments in the chat box, and then make sure that you select the option to share your comments with all panel members and all participants so that everyone can see your thoughts. And then we have a Q&A box as well, where you can share questions for the panel, and we'll certainly be trying to respond to some of those during the course of the session. So where do we start? Well, it's very clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has created very deep challenges at every level, from healthcare and societal cohesion through to the far-reaching economic impacts and disruption of every field of activity, from education to travel. And what we can see is that, in particular, some of the biggest questions emerging now are arising out of the crisis for government and governance globally, understanding how do we drive those things forward. Globally, questions are abounding regarding the scope and capacity to act of global institutions and whether new ones are required for an era of digitally powered economies. At the national level, in democratic nations, questions are arising over whether normal party divides should be abandoned in favour of governments of national unity. Other countries are facing tough choices about how much emergency power the executive should seek, when to relinquish it, and how to ensure proper oversight of what's done. At the operating level, many are having to work out how to run parliaments and the machinery of government and governance remotely. Finally, with a variety of electronic mechanisms being introduced to tag, track, and trace potential COVID-19 victims, huge civil liberties issues are arising over the extent and control of state surveillance. These drive some secondary questions around how do we monitor and regulate the private sector entities that might develop and run such services. So we can see that there's a huge set of fascinating questions to be explored. I'm delighted to say that I have an eminent panel of speakers to help explore these issues with us. We have Miranda Mantey, Geoff Mulgan, and Clare Nelson. And I'm going to let them take a few seconds each to just introduce themselves. So Clare, perhaps you could start by just introducing yourself, and then we'll go around.
Yeah, I'm Clare Nelson. Good morning, everyone. Well, good morning for me here in the northeast part of the United States of America. I'm in the DC metro area. As you heard, my name is Clare Nelson. I practice as a futurist and a sustainability engineer, and I'm from the Caribbean, so my personal passion and research passion is around small island developing states and to a larger extent Africa as well. So with that, I'll pause.
Miranda.
Hi, I'm Miranda Mantey. I am based out of Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I'm a strategy and foresight analyst at ATB Financial, which is a regional financial institution here in Alberta. And we're working on what is the future beyond banking. So that's where a lot of my research and interests lie.
I'm Geoff.
Hi there, yeah, my name is Geoff Mulgan. I'm currently, or recently, professor at University College London. For many years before that, I was chief executive of the UK's National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. And probably more relevant to this discussion, I worked in government. I ran the UK government strategy team, was head of policy in the Prime Minister's office, and I've worked also in city government, European Commission and UN as well, including on questions of risk.
Excellent. Well, we're going to have a fantastic discussion with each of the panelists coming up, but I'm going to start us off with a little exploration of what I believe to be some of the issues for government and society on the brink. We're trying to map out what the future might look like, and I think there are a whole set of issues that each of us could identify that we need to be wrestling with as we try and frame the role of government, the governance frameworks we try and address, and that balance between, if you like, the high-minded political concepts and organizing concepts that many of us talk about, and then the practical realities of life on the ground for citizens that we're trying to represent. And so I want to share with you just 10 quick thoughts that we've just written about that we think are challenges that governments are going to have to wrestle with as they map out the journey out of the crisis and into the future. The first of those is around individual financial security. We've seen very clearly that there are many people now who don't have enough savings for the next month, the next week, or even the next day alone. We've seen in the UK, the demand for food banks rise by 40%. We're seeing national governments around the world having to step in and take over the feeding of large chunks of their populations. So there's a real question arising now of when we leave the pandemic behind, or as we move out of it, how much responsibility does government have now around creating the mechanisms to secure individuals financially? No poverty and zero hunger are the first two goals in the Sustainable Development Goals. The question is how much attention are we going to pay to those? And inevitably that raises the question of whether we move to some form of universal basic income and universal basic services, maybe as a temporary measure while we retrain for the jobs of the future and the opportunities of the future. The second area is around health access. We've seen very uneven patterns of health access around the world through this crisis, which has been reflected in mortality rates amongst different communities, amongst communities with different levels of access to healthcare resources. And there are huge concerns about how that might play out in the year ahead for those communities that still have very little medical access. So one of the questions again for governments is how much responsibility do you want to take for maximizing health access? Which leads to another question of what should our health and elder care systems look like? Here in the UK, there's been a massive furore about how little attention was paid to the elder care system and the number of people in care homes who were catching COVID-19 and dying from it. And overall, the capacity of our health system to cope with something of this nature, not just in terms of the physical structure of the system, but also the access to resources, personal protective equipment, testing, and planning for incidents on this scale. So there's questions going to be raised across the world as to what do we want to do with our care systems going forward and how much we want to invest in them post-pandemic to make sure that we're in a better position going forward, not just for future crises, but also for the day-to-day care needs of our nation. The next is around personal physical safety. One of the dirty little secrets that's really revealed itself during the crisis is the rise in domestic violence in many countries around the world. Many more incidents being reported to the police, but estimates are that anywhere between 3 and 10 times that number are occurring, but going unheard because people aren't calling the health lines, they're not calling the police, they're not reaching out. The question again for governments is, knowing that this is a deep and painful issue in society, how much do we want to focus on addressing these kind of social challenges as we go forward? Which leads into our next issue, which is around mental health. Again, the warnings are rising about the scale of mental health that was already there. The estimates are that it costs something like 10% of global GDP already. But during the crisis, the feeling is that many more people have been pushed into despair, deep stress, and feelings of isolation and other mental health issues. And the question again is, to what extent does government feel it has a role to play in tackling that as a societal issue going forward, and what priority does it place on that? One of the issues that's been raised for many governments is the extent to which they either do foresight or make use of it. Foresight practitioners have been warning since the 1960s about the possibilities of health crises such as a pandemic. This isn't a black swan event by any sense, it's a highly predictable event. But many nations have found themselves both lacking the foresight or the preparedness to deal with something like this. So even if they've identified that this is an issue, many have found that they didn't have the mechanisms in place to respond quickly, to resource up quickly, to mobilize support staff in healthcare or policing, whatever, which is why you see so many currently scrambling to put in place the responses almost after the act. So the question is, how much do we want to invest going forward in developing deeper foresight and then developing the mechanisms to respond to the risks and opportunities that we see coming out of that? Clearly, at the heart of the challenge for most governments is the issue of funding, with warnings that the US economy could shrink by 30% in the next quarter and a $2 trillion bailout package, many other countries running to the tens of hundreds of billions in terms of the total cost, both from a health perspective and a financial underpinning perspective. The question is, how will governments choose to deal with this on the way out? Will we return to austerity measures with a relatively uneven distribution of the impact? Or will we take some very different approaches to how we pay for the cost of this and the rebuilding of economies and the rebooting of economies to try and avoid the potential for a deep recession or a lasting depression. One of the questions that's been raised by many people, the President of the United States in particular, is the role of global institutions. The World Health Organization in particular has come in for some serious criticism from some quarters. Others have seen it as their go-to resource for advice and guidance on how to navigate the pandemic. So the question arises as to how fit our global institutions are to lead us through issues like this. How fit are they for the future? And if not, how do we either modernize them or create new institutions to replace them in the areas where we think there's a capacity or a capability gap? And how do we ensure the the independence of those institutions going forward? One of the things that's also been revealed is that countries that were already considered weak or failing are now being pushed over the edge. The latest estimates suggest that Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen could see upwards of 2 or 3 million deaths because of the pandemic, because they simply don't have the civil infrastructure now to deal with it. And we're seeing many more countries being pushed to the edge or over it by the sheer cost and challenge created by managing the COVID crisis. And the question arises for every government is, what role do we want to play in propping up those nations or helping them through? Do we leave them to their own devices, or do we try and corral global resources to make sure that we have a truly globally engaged and supportive rescue program coming out of this? And finally, that points to the role of some of the institutions around, the power institutions. We saw in the global financial crisis, the G7 and G20 really corral their forces to make sure that the world didn't tip into a prolonged downturn. This time round, they've been conspicuous by their absence. None of the major blocs, whether it's the G7, the G20, ASEAN, SCO, have really come out with anything, that, or the EU indeed, which sounds like a message of global solidarity or a plan for how we take the whole globe out of this and how we rebase ourselves on the way out. And so there's some real questions there about how do we get global power to work together to ensure that the outcome is beneficial to all. So that was a very rapid tour through just a few ideas to get the conversation going. And I'm going to throw us straight into a poll on that to see what you think about some of those issues. I haven't asked the question on all of them, but let's put a quick poll up there and see which of those do you see as the biggest priority for governments in the next couple of years coming out of this. And I've combined a couple on the screen. The panelists can vote as well. The trick with our polls is there's quite a few, so the trick is to vote fast. First answer is the best answer. And we will share these polls afterwards. We'll share the slides and we'll share the aggregate responses from the polls so people can see what sort of responses came out. And just while you're polling, just another quick reminder that if you have comments, please put them in the chat box and make sure you choose the option to comment to all panelists and all participants. If you have questions, put those in the Q&A and we'll try and respond to the most popular and the most provocative questions there. Okay, we've had a fair smattering of you respond. Let's have a look at the results. So we're pretty evenly split between individual financial security, foresight. I wonder if that's because of the nature of the audience of this, little selection bias there. Funding the future, and then followed by global institutions and health. So quite a smattering across those. Personal physical safety, interesting, didn't rank very highly, nor the needs of weak and failing nations, which is an interesting place. So we're going to now move to the first of our guest panelists, Geoff Mulgan. And Geoff, I'm going to start you off with a question for you to tackle for us. You've been observing and advising on the use of technology and intelligence tools to help countries navigate through and out of the crisis. In this regard, what do you expect governments to focus on in the next 12 months? And then in the 2 or 3 years after that, how do developed and developing nations really start to tackle these issues that you raise? So I'll hand over to you to share some thoughts on that.
Well, thanks, Rohit, and thanks for the good pictures of collapsing countries and so on. I mean, perhaps there's one comment before I share a few slides so you don't have to look at my face. I think it's really important to recognize in this whole discussion just how little we know. We've got a series of profound uncertainties around us. We have an uncertainty about the health. No one even knows about the patterns of immunity, etc., or evolution of the virus. We've got deep uncertainty on the economics. All the patterns globally have been incredibly uneven and quite unlike what the experts predicted. So we all need, I guess, to start with humility about just how uncertain almost every dimension of the next few months is going to be. So I start with a picture of Leviathan because in a way, the extraordinary thing of the last few weeks has been the return of big government. Government playing a decisive role in propping up the economy, paying people something not unlike universal basic incomes in some countries, closing borders, things we hadn't really considered for years. And in some ways, this is a kind of return of a big government. We can come back to some of the economic sides of it. I'm just going to focus on the intelligence side, because I think this may be one of the lasting legacies of the crisis. And this is the question of the role of government in trying to orchestrate all these different kinds of intelligence, the observations, the models, the memory, empathy with people, perhaps suffering, isolation, etc. And I think we may be seeing a step change in how that sort of cognitive role of government is thought about. You can see that in many of the things which have been done already. Now, obviously, all governments have these kind of control rooms. That's Cobra in the UK, you know, in theory, the Prime Minister sits there, so running everything in real time, slightly misleading picture. And perhaps more interesting is the spread of, you know, models and arguments about models predicting different patterns. I've never seen a phenomenon where there was as much debate about conflicting models as this. We've seen extraordinary uses of data. That's the Seoul City website. I do quite a lot with them, you know, who've actually done a fantastic job of using all sorts of different data sources to track, to trace, and to contain the virus. And they're one of the countries which has done much, much better than Europe, or North America. We've seen new apps. This is Singapore's Trace Together there, which other countries are now sort of copying. Taiwan, which created digital fences to manage quarantining of people in Taiwan, again, has been an exemplar in lots of other ways. And all of these are in some ways pointing to different ways you can orchestrate different kinds of intelligence. And I put up on the screen there one from Bangladesh, which has a fantastic team in their government who've been working on collective intelligence devices of different kinds. And this is what they've pulled together, both to track what's happening in the country on infections, but also to manage cash support for tens of millions of people whose livelihood has gone away. And I think in some of these, you see a possible future of government bringing together different kinds of knowledge, intelligence, modeling, etc., for crises, but in the future, I hope for things like climate change, care for the elderly, and so on. And the final point is that the best of these aren't just done by government to people, they're also done as a partnership between the state and citizens. And we're seeing an extraordinary innovation around platforms for society. I've just shown here on the screen on the top left, one of many platform devices which help you organize care around vulnerable older people or people with disabilities. And the ways in which these platform technologies have been mobilized for that is fantastic. I mean, in a way, it's amazing that Facebook, Google, and so on were so slow in doing this in the past, even though lots of people were trying to encourage them. But now the crisis has suddenly achieved in a few weeks what might otherwise have taken 20 years. And the bottom right is a quite complicated one from New York, actually, but one of many examples of civic organizations bringing together multiple bits of technology to try and manage things like food deliveries, visits, and so on. And again, it's taking the best of what's available in the digital world to solve a public need problem. And these are all, for me, different ways of organizing collective intelligence alongside the intelligence of the state. And we're seeing a little bit of this also on the science side. So Foldit is a long-standing collective intelligence project on proteins. And they've now opened up to the world using their platform to try and help design antiviral proteins for coronavirus. So this is collective intelligence in science for the sake of solving problems. And there are other ones on the testing side, on PPE and so on. All of these mobilizing thousands, if not millions of people's brains to try and co-create the solutions to this extraordinary crisis. So the optimistic vision of the future is not a kind of Leviathan where the state becomes massively more powerful and Amazon takes over the entire world, but something more like what I call a sort of government as collective intelligence, where you have these assemblies around issues like COVID initially, but increasingly around things like carbon in the economy, care for the elderly, perhaps unemployment, where you bring together your observations, your models, your analysis, your memory, creativity, all in systems of action and learning so that together we solve problems. And I wrote about this, this is a shameless bit of advertising in my book, Big Mind. What I didn't expect was that a crisis like this would actually dramatically accelerate governments doing the sort of things I was writing about in that book a couple of years ago. But that is what is happening in front of our eyes, and it's quite exciting in a way.
Excellent. Well, I really want to pick up on one of the points you made there around, or the examples you gave, which was Bangladesh. So high density, very much a low income developing nation. And one of the concerns when we talk about these big tech tools and these collective intelligence tools is it always feels like they're tools for more sophisticated nations with a well-developed technology infrastructure and a digitally literate society. The indication there is that this is something, or some of these tools could actually be rolled out pretty much globally. What's your take about the prospects for developing nations in particular, and the weak and failing ones, to be able to adopt some of these tools as part of the mechanism to help them out of crisis and stabilize their economies?
Well, it's going to be very uneven. I mean, China obviously moved first in using mobile phone tracing to manage the crisis, the millions who left Wuhan just before it was closed, and then with Alipay using these apps to sort of signal who's allowed to move and who isn't. As you say, Bangladesh used to be thought of as it is a pretty poor country in many ways, but it has in some ways quite a good telecommunications infrastructure. A lot of people have a mobile phone or access to one. And India, thanks to things like Aadhaar, which is the biometric ID system, which has about 1.2 billion people on it now. Offshoots of that are organizing these kind of collective intelligence societal platforms in ways which I think are way ahead of what's happened in Europe or North America. So I think our sort of picture of the world, the old picture of kind of the developed world and the developing world doesn't quite fit. Obviously, there are many places where there is no digital connectivity and where managing this crisis will be incredibly hard. And you mentioned, obviously, Afghanistan, Yemen, large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But it's striking that the best performers so far in the crisis have been East Asian countries, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, not the old, Germany. Well, Germany's actually done pretty well, but certainly France, UK, US are doing pretty badly by any measures. And then other countries like the Bangladeshis can often leapfrog in perhaps their agility in using technology, where the slightly over rigid systems of the old world have struggled, including in my country.
Great. Well, I'm going to combine a couple of questions that have come in from the participants. That what you talked about has raised both excitement but also concern. People are worried about the implications for personal privacy, the invasion or the erosion of GDPR rights in Europe, and the potential for big brother control from government. What's your take on those issues? Where do you see the balance evolving to? Will governments just use this as a mechanism to gather a lot of data about us and then gradually start to influence and control us more? Or is this really just a mechanism to organize better and ensure better and more effective responses?
Well, again, I think the crisis is accelerating focus on issues we should have been attending to anyway, which is how do you organize this trade-off? On the one hand, the more you can link data together, whether it's in the economy or health or environment, the more you can solve complex problems. But equally, the more you do that, the more the state becomes powerful relative to the citizen. And so we're seeing many governments using the crisis to strengthen their coercive power. China obviously can now track even more where everyone is, why they were there, when they were there. In Israel, the intelligence service Shin Bet has been essentially accessing all mobile phone data to track where everyone is going without any legal constraint. The sort of autocrats in countries like Turkey or Hungary have used the crisis to take new powers. Where I hope we will go is to a new settlement. And I published a thing last week on what that might look like, where on the one hand, and this is in some ways quite a complicated issue, but I think we will need new norms of what's called data minimization, where you don't automatically spray around everything about your, every detail about yourself, your passport, your bank account, as happens in the current era, the sort of Facebook, Google era, where so much data was harvested from us without real consent. I think we'll go to data minimization. I think we will also see the spread of laws like Europe's GDPR, which actually has turned out to be very flexible through this crisis, that it can cope with needing to adjust degrees of personal control over data in a crisis, but with very severe penalties if that is abused when the crisis is over. And then finally, I think we will need new governance institutions, which I call data trusts. And I've set out various designs how these could work, which in a very visible and democratically accountable way, talk through and work out the trade-offs where we might very well be willing to see a lot of our personal data opened up and used during a crisis, but we definitely don't want that to be happening in 2 years' time. We definitely don't want that data to be going either to the wrong company or the wrong government agency. And at the moment, the world completely lacks these governance institutions for what has become almost the central fact of our lives, which is data, which we generate every time we shop, every time we travel, every time we pick up our phone. And this is overdue that we fix this, both in technology terms and in governance terms. And my hope is that in much of the world, the crisis will get us to where we probably needed to be anyway. And that is a very different place from what either Silicon Valley wanted or the Chinese government probably wants.
That leads us beautifully into a question from Maria Ivanova. And her question, actually, before I ask the question, some of you are writing beautiful questions, but they're a paragraph long. And so we try and keep them to 1 or 2 sentences. And just a reminder that in the chat, please make sure you send your comments to the panel and all participants. There's a drop-down menu where you can see who you send them to. If you send them only to the panel, then your carefully crafted comment will only be seen by the 4 of us after the event. Whereas if you want everyone to see your comment, make sure you post it to the panel and all participants. And make sure you put short questions in the Q&A box. Anyway, we have a great question from Maria Ivanova about this issue of control. Well, it touches on this issue of global control. Her question is, what would be a productive role for international institutions in this new collective intelligence model?
Well, there's a big question. Again, we've got a sort of slightly odd position that most of our global institutions were designed in the 1940s. That's when the UN system was created, the World Bank, the IMF, all these other things. And they are increasingly, in some ways, out of step with the big issues of today. So we have almost no functioning global institutions around data, around artificial intelligence, around all of those, around the governance of the internet, which we're using at this very moment. So there's a sort of massive governance gap there, which of course is quite hard to fill in the era of Trump and of very strong leaders like Xi, Modi, Putin, and so on. But my hope is at some point we do create truly global institutions of collective intelligence. My belief is if we were creating the UN now, not in the 1940s, at its heart would be organizations focused on organizing global data, global knowledge, global experience to solve global problems like the SDGs. Money would still be important, but be less important than data and knowledge. And in that sense, the global institutions will be like what's happened in the economy, where the best capitalized companies in the world are ones based around platforms, data, knowledge. And there's now this mismatch where the public systems are sort of 30, 40, 50 years out of date compared to where business has gone. And that would allow us to be doing a much better job than I think we're doing at the moment of really organizing global intelligence around climate change, around migration, around conflict prevention, all the things we know about, which have of course all being pushed to a side by this crisis. My fear is we won't really be able to fix these global governance issues unless we have the leaderships of the big countries really focused on this as a problem. And the complete failure of US leadership at the moment is a disaster for the world, really, and it's left a gap which no one else can fill.
Excellent. Let's bring Clare in at this point. Clare, so there's quite a lot of questions about the developing nations and comments about the developing nations, and Geoff's just touched on the potential for these tools to be adopted if there's the will. You have a very strong perspective on the Caribbean in particular. What's your take on their view around the use of collective intelligence as a set of mechanisms to help navigate through the crisis and then build a platform for the future?
The view of collective intelligence, certainly in the Caribbean, and certainly I would say in marginalized groups in America, which I belong to in this case as African American, Black American, is very much one of suspicion. Certainly it didn't help that around the time of this, there's a big conversation going on around the role of 5G. And it may not on the radar for most people, but it's certainly on the radar for the average person walking the street. And myself, quite frankly, as an engineer, thinking like, is this real? Is it not real? So I would say intellectually, when we have, because the Caribbean region has been governed by CARICOM, which is a regional organization, the idea of data sharing between governments is one thing, and that's quite accepted, and everybody is kind of giving the Caribbean Public Health Agency nice applause for how well it has been doing. But at the personal level, this idea of being spied on by the government is something that will be resisted strongly. And we have not yet put in place a law like the GDPR law that was in Europe. But you see companies now certainly paying attention to those things. And the other issue with this data intelligence is that we don't yet have fully functional or very strong cybersecurity systems in place. So governments have the policies, they have the laws, but as a function in terms of the institutional infrastructure, many of the banks, the companies are still very weak in terms of cybersecurity. So people would certainly not want to feel like they're being watched. Nevertheless, just like in Bangladesh and Ghana and other places, our bright young stars are busy trying to come up with helping. And I do think that the Caribbean voice is going to be, and the small island voice in particular, because the Caribbean belongs to the Alliance of Small Island States. And I think collectively, because of climate change, they have been coming around to sort of a more moving en masse towards the same issues. And so I think you're going to see that the Alliance of Small Island States will take a position very similar to what the Europeans have done and follow Europe very closely, in large part because of the long-standing relationships between the ACP and EU, obviously, and in large part because the last few months have been quite challenging in terms of our relationship to the United States. So that's a rocky place for us right now.
Thanks, Clare. Geoff, if I can bring you back in on an issue that Clare raised, which again I think talks particularly to the developing nations around to what extent can we do this if we don't have the cybersecurity infrastructure in there? If we're grasping, or if you like, taking more and more of the citizen data in, we're using it to positive effects, but it's also at risk of abuse. I mean, what's being done around the global data security models or cybersecurity to enable more countries to play in this space?
Well, the cybersecurity has been one of the big topics of the last 2 or 3 years, with a lot of work under the ITU and others, a lot of proposals of new cybersecurity standards, and very slightly ad hoc arrangements between the big platforms, the telecom operators and others. But again, I think there's a bit of you know, it shows there's a bit of missing governance. This sort of comes under, it goes to very technical committees of the ITU, but often there are very political issues embedded in how you handle and organize cybersecurity. So I think the jury's out on whether we will be able to solve this at a global level, or whether medium term there will be in fact solutions at a regional level. The EU will, you know, perhaps adopt quite stringent cybersecurity rules, which will then prevent data flows, trade, etc., over its borders. China may go for a completely different set of arrangements. This is the long forecast splinternet replacing the internet. And again, there's a complete vacuum of global leadership. Have you ever heard, you know, a president or chancellor or prime minister of a major power really talking about this as the great issue of our times? And yet, to my mind, for the next 10 years, at a global level, it is cybersecurity, data flows, protecting personal privacy, handling AI. These should be some of the top issues of global governance, but they're almost invisible.
Excellent, thank you. Well, thank you for such an informative and thought-provoking opening session. And to build on that now, we're going to hand over to Miranda Mantey, because she's got some more thoughts to share on this. And Miranda, I'd love you to reflect on what you heard from Geoff, and I'm going to give you a question as well to get your thinking going. The crisis has really put an a spotlight on these issues of citizen surveillance. From your perspective, what was already happening before we hit the crisis, and what powerful new developments are you seeing that you think can make a difference? And what are the positive and more concerning aspects of that from your perspective, from what's going on? So bringing a kind of North American slant to the conversation.
For sure, yeah. And so I think what Geoff hit on that's quite interesting is the difference between the Eastern nations and the Western nations, and what's been going on there previously. And so Eastern nations are generally a lot more open to data sharing. And there was a survey question that asked, would you share personal data listing financial, driving records for benefits, such as lower cost and personalization? And in China, 38% said yes, in comparison to the US, which was 25%, Canada, which was actually 14%, and an international average of 27%. And so what we're seeing is there's a lot more willingness to share quite serious personal data for a certain benefit. On top of all of that, China specifically is the center of a social credit scoring system. And this, I think, is a little bit misunderstood. We're sending an article on that later, but in that country, whether they like it or not, they're used to having their details and all of their information tracked. And so the standard has actually been set that, you know, this is what it is, and COVID didn't really change that. On the flip side, in the Western markets, we're a lot more adverse to data sharing. And I think that's because we have been let down by our governments and corporations in the past, and we don't want our information shared. And so what's happening is COVID's bringing in two drivers that are changing this. And the first is the medical need. So contact tracing is quite effective. And some research has shown that apps that trace people's locations can seriously reduce infection rates when just 60% of the population adopts it. On top of that, there is an attitude driver, as I call it, and that's fear. So people are scared, and when they're scared, they're more open to being tracked and to have people watching them. And if you look at a lot of the US's mass surveillance program, most of them were born out of an act of war or terrorism. And people are worried, and they're going to be more willing to allow access to this data in the name of security and stability, really. However, people don't really like this. We can't forget we don't want this in the Western world too much. And so what's happening is there is this prioritization of privacy in regards to building these types of apps. I'm seeing two systems. And so one is the centralized system that's run by governments. The UK is an example of this, and they're building it, and they're saying it's better that the government has access, because then we can fully evaluate the infection rate and the spread and see what's going on. However, the concern with this is this opens up the world of, you know, unlawful detainment. So can governments now use this data and force you to stay in your home? And with the Emergency Power Acts a lot of countries have put in place, there is potential for that. And the question becomes, when does this actually end? On the flip side, we're also seeing the decentralized approach, which is what the tech giants are working towards. And their goal is to limit the ability of hackers to use this, as well as limit the ability of authorities to utilize this data. And so they want they want to utilize kind of the blockchain system and have people have complete anonymization. And so it's giving people at least the perceived ability of privacy. But I do question if this is actually going to happen, or if it's essentially like a marketing facade to some extent, because regardless of if it's centralized or decentralized, there is someone that will have this data somewhere or have access to it. And there'll be a spectrum of how many people, how easy it is to get, but there still is somebody that has this key. And what we need to puzzle through is, who do we want to have access? Do we want governments? Do we want corporations? Or how do we want to try to position ourselves? In regards to some of the implications, on the positive side, I do see this as a great step forward of both tech companies and governments prioritizing or attempting to prioritize privacy and react to consumer demands, and not just kind of bend to the will of each other and make things a lot less safe for people. The risks, I think there's a couple, that's a little bit bigger of a list, but a couple things really stood out to me. One is whether or not we can fully anonymize and privatize, as I mentioned. And so an example of this is South Korea, which has done really well in the response. They published the information and the travel routes of people that were infected. And it's completely anonymized, privatized, they say it's safe. However, sometimes these routes are actually so detailed that citizens have been able to reverse engineer and find out who these people are. And then these people are getting publicly shamed. And an article that we're going to send out has quotes from somebody who was discovered, and they're pleading with the government to prioritize privacy better, because it is quite difficult to actually truly anonymize data. On top of that, my other question is whether it's centralized or decentralized, do we have the right checks and balances in place for this system? Amnesty International actually published a list of conditions that governments should follow to make sure that they're not overstepping their reach when it comes to location and surveillance. Edward Snowden mentioned that he's concerned that this is a step towards the US government continuing their surveillance beyond what's needed. And so both on the government side, and even if it's run by tech companies, which maybe is a bigger challenge, do we have those right checks and balances in place for ensuring that we're not overstepping our privacy there?
Excellent. Let's move on from there then. Another topic you and I were talking about in the run-up to this was the fact that we're seeing some really interesting public sector innovation going on here, and innovation around the area of regulation. What are the most striking developments you're seeing, and what are the longer-term possibilities there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one that we're seeing in Canada that I found quite interesting was that the Canadian government actually amended their patent laws. And so in Canada, the government can either use a one-year license to make vaccines, drugs, or other technologies themselves, or they can essentially authorize anybody else to do so as well. The patent owner will still be paid, but essentially this is crowdsourcing and opening up the market so that we can innovate quicker and faster. And what's fascinating here is that it wasn't necessarily a clear-cut decision, because in other places they're looking to increase these patents so that corporations are more incentivized to actually build, because there's a return guaranteed. However, what I think is important about Canada's approach here is that it's reprioritizing the greater good of everybody, as opposed to just the corporations, and that it's also showcasing collaboration. And from what we've seen with international collaboration and working together through all sectors, collaboration is key to addressing a crisis like this. And this is a step towards ensuring that even more so. On top of that, another one that isn't necessarily from COVID, but I think is highlighted by this crisis, is the continuous updating of government services in a technological sense. And in Canada, we've had an extremely successful emergency response benefit. It was up within a couple weeks, and people could apply and get their money in their bank account the very next day. So extremely efficient. And the reason that it's so efficient is because for years we've been updating those services on the back end. And in a time of crisis, it's a couple of switches to flip as opposed to completely rebuilding a new system. And so governments continuing to build on that and be nimble in their technology backends is highlighted as greater importance. On top of that, also something Geoff hit on quite a bit with the collective intelligence is just open data sets. The governments are publishing their data. They're not just masking it through different statistics. Instead, they're showing us the actual models that have proven to be right or proven to be wrong, and they're willing to live with that conclusion. And it's enabling researchers, public health authorities, and even the general public on how we should adapt and work together to come out of this stronger.
Excellent. Just a reminder to people, I forgot to enable the voting on questions, but I've done that now. So if anyone wants to vote on a question you're seeing, you can go in and vote on it. You can go and comment on it. You should be able to see all the questions there. So, and we'll try and answer the most popular questions as we go through. I've got one third question for you, Miranda. One of the things we've seen is governments around the world scrabbling to secure supplies of all sorts of medical equipment. And it's actually changing their procurement strategies for the longer term. What kind of changes are we seeing there, and what implications do you see that having from a kind of political power point of view as countries try and secure the future from a supply basis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the first big thing we'll see is amendments to international trade agreements. So right now, there are this kind of blurry lines of whether or not countries can block the trade of medical goods at this point. And I think going forward, a lot of these agreements are going to have clauses that you can't restrict the trade of medical equipment, and have really concrete wording around that, because it is showing to be a very weak situation we've put ourselves in. On top of that, there's the question of whether supply chains will become more domesticated or more diversified. It's quite clear we can no longer rely on one country to be the supplier of a good, because that adds quite a bit of risk. And I see this going likely towards both, but potentially more strongly towards the domestication side. And part of the reason for that is that with COVID, we have seen that movement forward in sustainability, and we're seeing things that we need to do to increase our environmental awareness and improve our conditions. And domestication will provide that movement for us. So I think the big shift here is that generally we've seen that low cost, low inventory, just-in-time delivery are the priorities of supply chains. And I think that what's going to switch is for certain cornerstone goods for society, it's going to be proximity, guarantee service, and access to products as the #1 importance. An example of this is that Canada actually signed a 5-year contract with a Canadian medical equipment manufacturer for them to make masks. And what's interesting is this manufacturer doesn't currently make masks, and they don't have the facilities to. So this 5-year contract is essentially an investment to build these facilities for Canada. And that's not a short-term play at all. And so I think that we'll see this a lot more in other countries, along with these diversified supply chains. And for the countries that maybe can't domesticate, there will also likely be a building of reserves. So like we build oil reserves for army ships, there'll be reserves of medical masks and PPE going forward.
Excellent. Okay, well, before we bring the panel in, let's take your polling question. We have, there we go. So this is a question around the use of contact tracing apps even. So if you could all just take a few seconds to vote. Okay, let's end the polling and share the results. So the biggest single group seem to be in favor of a decentralized app developed by government. Least popular seems to be a decentralized app developed by someone that we don't know at all. And then the others seem to be pretty evenly spread amongst the respondents. Okay, I'm actually going to do one more polling question while we're doing polling. This is one that we should have asked after Geoff. So this is about the post-pandemic future of government and governance. Let's get this one up on the screen. So how do you see the post-pandemic future of governments evolving in your country in particular? And just a reminder while you're voting again, you can vote on the questions that people are asking, so we can see the most popular ones. And again, we still see quite a lot of comments going into the chat that are just coming to the panel. Please do select the option to share them with everyone. Okay, let's cast our final votes on this one. Coming in thick and fast. Okay, right, let's have a look at this one. So most of you feel like your government will seize more power and control, but there's quite a lot of optimism around experimentation. And then an equal number thinking that either their systems will become more chaotic or that there'll be no change from the current model. And I don't know whether those two are the same thing. Actually, they could be taken as the same thing. So let's bring in our other panel members. Geoff, anything there that surprises you from those results?
Well, I actually clicked on more chaotic for that last one, which was, I didn't really want to, but I fear that may be the case. Can I just make a couple of comments on what Miranda said, which I thought was really interesting and perhaps can lead into a debate. So I think, as she said, there's in a way a big dilemma for the next few years, which you could characterize as between optimization and resilience. We've had an economy and a whole model of regulation in much of the world, which has focused on efficiency, optimization, which in turn has led to very, very long, complex supply chains of all kinds. And then in a crisis, you suddenly discover you can't get the medical equipment you thought you might need. And is one of the blind spots of modern economics is it doesn't really have concepts of resilience. And there's long been a debate of whether you should, in a sense, organize both public policy and regulation and also things like trade to give greater weight to resilience, which means having redundancy, means having spare capacity, means having waste. It has to almost by definition be less efficient. But my guess, as Miranda said, is certainly in relation to things like energy, food supplies, perhaps medical ones. I think we will see a significant shift towards prioritizing security of supply, resilience over classic efficiency and optimization. And then the second thing I just want to mention, which has been a lot of comment in the chat, is I think there are some real dilemmas around these data questions. So Europe has had a whole team developing anonymized tracing models using Bluetooth and so on. There's a lot of discussion of using blockchain, again, to maintain anonymization. But in a way, those fudge the difficult question, which is if someone is infected and isn't willing to change their behavior, do you want your government to force quarantine on them? And at some point, I mean, I personally would much rather my government did quarantine them than leave it in completely up to them whether they decide to do the right thing or not. And so this is, I fear, a fatal flaw in often very well-intentioned technology projects at the moment. They work if everyone is an angel, but it doesn't require very many people to be a bit antisocial and they completely fall apart. So therefore, in a way, our big choice will be, are we willing to have a somewhat more coercive state, but for a limited period to fix the problem? Anyway, that's one of many, many dilemmas which we're going to all have to face in the next few months.
Miranda, would you like to respond to that? But I'm also going to tie that to a question from an anonymous attendee. By the way, some of you who are asking questions that are getting a lot of votes, they're more general, and I think we'll bring those in the panel discussion later. But here's one for you, Miranda, if you could respond to Geoff. And we have an anonymous question that says, trust in government is changing around the world, giving potential acceptance of new systems. What are some of the new systems of governance that can arise from the recent developments in society and citizenship? So, in a sense, how do you respond to what Geoff's talking about there? And what kind of systems and governance are starting to be talked about to make sure that governments don't overstep their authority, overstep what they're allowed to do with the data, and how they can ensure public confidence that they're doing safe things with our data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in responding to Geoff, definitely agree with the fact that the concern and the real question once these apps are developed is what can we actually do with this information, and to what extent can individuals be told what to do by the government? Are we going to allow people to be, forced quarantine? And I think the majority of people would say yes, but do we have the legal authority to do that? And at what point should that legal authority end is the other question, because we don't want to fall into the trap of giving the government these emergency powers and then have it end up lasting way past when they should be using it. In regards to kind of the new governance models, and this one isn't utilized by governments as much, but what Geoff mentioned earlier of data trusts is a new and emerging governance model for how data should be managed. On the government side of things, I think it's been quite interesting watching, especially in the US in the past couple of years. I think it was 2016 when there was that phone from a mass shooter that it was an Apple phone, and the government subpoenaed Apple to unlock it, and Apple wouldn't. And so watching that interplay of, it's interesting because governments are mandating how tech companies should be responding to privacy and prioritizing privacy. And on the flip side, they're also, suing tech companies to get access to that data as well. And so watching the interplay of tech companies and governments will be something quite fascinating going forward. But I think right now, the tech companies are responding to consumer demands, and that is the privacy, and that they're using the emerging technologies to be the driver of consumer privacy. And I don't think governments have that as much at the center of their interest. So I see governance of data going forward being driven by how tech companies are utilizing emerging technologies over what governments are actually doing in regards to that. And then my final point there is, as we've talked about the GDPR, I do believe that'll move into a lot of other countries, but I also think there are challenges with that regulation, including how do we build AI models if the data they're built off of might disappear in the future, and how do we ensure that the right to forget is combined with building technology and still having the capabilities to build that technology to the best of its ability. So I don't think there's any clear answer to that question yet, but there's a lot of places that are being looked into both on a technological and data governance side.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you again. Fascinating stuff, and some really interesting comments and questions coming out of this. One of the issues that you've all raised or talked about a lot here is this issue of global institutions, global governance. So maybe this is a good time to take our little poll about the future of our global institutions. Much loved of POTUS and not so popular elsewhere. So let's just cast our votes. What do we do about these institutions? How do we make sure they work for us? Do we need them? Okay, let's see what the vote looks like. It's interesting here, very few in favour of scrapping them in any way or leaving them as they are. The majority seem to think that we modernise what we've got, and then followed closely by 42% who think that we need a new breed of institution to explore what we need for the next wave of global development. Okay, so we're now going to take a slight change of tack, and Clare Nelson is going to be our next panelist, giving us a slightly different perspective. So we talked quite a lot about tech and data and the tools of collective intelligence and how they offer us some platforms for the future. We're now going to focus more on, if you like, the ground level of the kind of citizen experience. And Clare, you have a foot in both camps. You cover the Caribbean, you live in Washington, DC. What are we learning from a people perspective you know, about the effectiveness of government and the evolution of government and governance in the near-term future. Let's start there, and then let's think broader after that.
Well, certainly I would say it has been an eye-opener for me. I've been in America for more than half of my life, but I never thought I would live to see the day when people would take to the streets in certain states with assault rifles to live free or die, the right to live free or die from COVID. Watching from Washington as a citizen, as someone who's lived there for so long, and seeing what I call the total scramble for coherence by the national government, and thankfully then seeing the local and state levels come into play certainly made it very clear for all of us to see the fissures and cracks in the concept of states' rights versus the federal government. And we had already been in a place of, like, say, discomfort between red and blue states. And so in America, we've really seen a challenge of how do you have a national response when you have such distrust already between parties on the ground. Then came the news that people of African descent, Black people, were dying more than everybody else, and everything kind of went haywire. Because what you have is that not only now do you have like a states issue, you have also a class and a race issue in a very contentious space. And so it's the issue of governance when you have Congress then trying to do one thing, the House doing one thing, the Senate doing one thing, and then the federal government doing one thing, has been a very, let's say, interesting observation of how a democracy may not always work well because people are moving from emotion and not data. We're not a data-driven society. We're emotional-driven society. Then you have the relationship with the US as the big brother to those of us countries on the South. And there was other shock and awe in terms of the lack of leadership that one would typically expect from the United States government looking to its neighbors to the South, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And there was kind of no help to be had there for countries that have typically looked to the US for leadership. So it's like, okay, so the hemispheric agenda in terms of the US being the big brother that takes care of all of us in the global South, in the Americas, that's not gonna happen anymore. So as immigrants, most of us who are immigrants are thinking, okay, therefore, what's gonna happen in this what is happening right now is that there's new arrangements being made, new South to South cooperation happening, which is very interesting, both between Latin America and the Caribbean and as far as Africa. You see, for example, Cuba being welcomed around the region, the Cuban doctors with applause, and Americans saying, send the Cuban doctors here, we need them here. And then you have the people also saying, but we've heard that the US government is going to sanction countries who take help from Cuba. So that sends a new wave of terror. So people are feeling fear, people are feeling uncertainty, and of course, more importantly, the economic security you talked about is also a big issue. When will they go back to work? Because we do live, a lot of us, from paycheck to paycheck in this country. The social safety nets, yes, we have seen a huge CARES Act with dollars being spent, but even that is being like, okay, but you get it one time, but will it last? Will it run out? So there's a lot of challenges, I think, and there has not been the sort of comforting father figure president that Americans have come to expect and thought would have happened given using 9/11 as a lens through which we have been viewing this thing evolve. At the same time, I think we're seeing a sort of citizen gathering to kind of take the space of governance and local government doing very well. Many local governments, certainly here where I live, local government is seen as a very strong and good figure. The state government is seen as a very strong and good figure. So there is not that, I would say, abject fear, but at the federal level, yes, there is a still of like, we don't trust what's happening, we don't feel safe, we're not sure what's happening.
So some really interesting thoughts there about the kind of the challenges in society, which takes us neatly into the kind of next question, really, which is as we start to think about the future of government and governance, both from the Caribbean perspective, but also the kind of situation you described in the US, how do we make sure that that conversation is rooted in the needs of the people rather than a more intellectual conversation between policymakers, academics, and analysts? How do we make sure that this really resonates with the people on the ground, particularly when, as we've seen, the views, particularly in the US, are so diverse in terms of what people on the ground want? You know, how do we create that new governance and government in a way that's truly representative of such a diverse set of views?
That's a very good question. The first thing I noticed, not just from the US perspective, but globally, my first fear was that, while we have been focused on being locked inside, China has picked up people in Hong Kong. So our conspiracy theory now is, okay, maybe this is really a manufactured situation to dominate the world order. So we have that fear in the back of our heads. While this is happening, you see that the people voice in terms of the climate change movement, they've been silenced. The children no longer have a role to play in the streets. The women's movement can't be out in the streets. The Black Lives Matter movement can't be out in the streets. So how are we as citizens going to make ourselves known and heard when even the internet that we're living through could be shut off? So we're not sure, are our meetings being taped? Are our organizational things we've been doing online being taped? So there is, in a sense, the horror that we're seeing, okay, live free or die on the streets, but a part of us saying, well, good for them to be out there, because just in case the government is trying to close dissent, we have a few crazies out there who are making sure that the dissent doesn't happen. I do think, though, if we're to be optimistic, that's the fear side speaking. If we're to be optimistic, I do think that the level of organization we're seeing happening in different circles of influence, and the ways in which we're now negotiating power, and the ways in which some governments, some cities are coordinating response teams with citizens being a part of it, recovery advisory groups with citizens being a part of it, citizens from different sectors, the health sector, the financial sector, the small business sector, big industry. So many governments are doing the right thing in terms of bringing those voices in. And so those of us who are organizing at the NGO level, at the citizen level, are trying to use the levers of power we would have had before, our access before, to our mayors or to our Congress people. We're using those levers we would have had before to sort of drive what we see as the future we want, which is, let's not try to even think about planning to go back to the old normal, but let's use this opportunity as a way to kind of weave in our vision of what we had wanted in the first place. So the optimism, I think, is alive and well. And this issue of resilience, I think somebody raised. For those of us who have been always on the margins and on the outside, there's not that much difference in some ways in terms of how we're seeing our relationship. In fact, in some ways, we see it as we see a positive could come out of this, because we're used to being on the outside. And now, because of this massive disruption and chaos and people not knowing what to do, we feel that perhaps our voice can be heard. And that brings in the last piece, the question of the diaspora. In terms of the Caribbean diaspora, the remittances that we have been sending home to the region have been very much a part of the light support of the social safety net and the foreign exchange earnings of that region. And so some governments, certainly the Jamaican government where I'm from, have been much more structured in terms of engaging the diaspora. And I think that's going to hold them in good stead, because now that tourism is more or less comatose, right? The entire small island, all small island development states have been living off tourism for the last umpteen years. And that's going to be comatose for some time. So I think that the diasporas that have been organizing are going to have more room to be brought in, not just because of the financial pieces, but the other pieces of what they bring to the table. They bring intellectual resources, relationship capital with institutions here. They bring some social capital, and they also bring technology transfer, which should be critical for the recovery period moving into the regeneration for the future. So that's where I'm seeing things happening.
Excellent. And we run over a little bit over the time I was meant to have for this interview, but you know you always do this to me. You just say too many interesting things. I want to just pick you up on one thing here, because we've also talked about the role of the Sustainable Development Goals. Are they now just a forgotten relic of a bygone era, or do they have an enhanced role going forward in terms of helping particularly developing nations map a path out of the challenges?
I really totally have always been a believer in the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm unashamedly a globalist. Whether or not I believe in the conspiracy theory of one world government, part of me says we can't go back, right? We're using the system to talk, we're in one world. I believe the SDGs should be used as a North Star, not just for the developing world. I think America needs an SDG because the Black community in America is a developing nation, right? The indigenous people in America is a developing nation. The metrics are there to show the healthcare outcomes are no different or not much better off than those in Africa. In America, we've been talking about a universal basic income. Okay, fine. But to me, I have a lot of things in terms of how do you work that out? If people are just to be paid to do what? Stay home? I think people become very destructive if they stay home. So that needs to be thought about a little bit more. But I do think the SDG should be a North Star, and we should use this opportunity to recalibrate the metrics. I think it's the metrics that matter. We're using economic models that are dead, right? To me, they're dead. And we need to have new economic models, and the GDP needs to be replaced by a well-being index or some vulnerability index plus well-being that really truly measures what matters right now. We cannot go back to business as usual. The IMF cannot make pronouncements about bloodbaths in developing countries or disaster without changing their rules, but using the same rules, right, that were taking us along this path to try and go back to that. It's not going to work. So I do think the SDGs need to stay. SDGs, same thing about partnerships should be built on, and more people should be brought into this. In other words, this is an opportunity for the UN and other groups who've been working on the SDGs to spread this concept of sustainability literacy through more people, and the recovery period and the thrive period should be towards moving towards that still as a goal. We have to have a shared vision of the world we want.
Thank you, Claire. That's fascinating. And I've just seen a flurry of comments that you really excited a lot of people in that last particular discussion. So Miranda, let's bring you in here. In the research you did around these new tools, around innovation, around regulation, did you see any conversation, whether it was at the Canadian level or more globally, Miranda, did you see any kind of conversation about the role of the SDGs or how we internationalize some of these mechanisms to encompass the countries further down the economic stack?
It's a really good question. I'd say I didn't see as much on the SDGs, but I did see quite a lot of commentary on the WHO and what their role in the future is going to be. And I think throughout all of this, it's really illuminated that the structure of the WHO is not necessarily going to be feasible going forward. A lot of the advice given by the WHO is not being followed through on most of the WHO members at this point. They said, don't block international travel because it's going to damage the economy more than it's going to help the transmission, and pretty much every country has. And so the question becomes, how can we have an international organization going forward that has more, that the countries are more accountable to and are willing to follow through on, and what does that actually look like? And so I do think that there's a revamp, especially in regards to the funding structure. The WHO doesn't want to annoy any major donors to their organization, right? And so how can we adapt the funding structure so that these major donors don't have power over the WHO, and that the WHO has power over kind of the global world? And so I think in that space, there will be, I think the WHO is likely going to be a scapegoat for the next little bit. And what will that mean for their future and their role? I don't know. Will it destroy them? I honestly don't know, but I think something does need to change, and it'll be quite interesting to watch their development in the next couple of years.
Geoff, you've spent a significant amount of time both in government and advising government and commenting on government. To what extent do you think that the needs of developing nations and the SDGs in particular are being used, or even on the radar, or are used as a filter as policies being made, as they're thinking about what's next, whether it's for the UK or whatever country you're advising? to what extent is there a globalist perspective on this now, and this desire to make sure that we lift all boats in the recovery?
Well, before the crisis, I think it'd be fair to say the SDGs, I think in some ways have been an extraordinary success in creating a global language for talking about progress for the next 10 years, and not just in developing countries. So many rich countries are now using the SDG framework. Within the UK, Scotland and Wales do. England doesn't, you know, much as Scandinavia does, Italy does. I think Canada's beginning to as well. So they become this kind of semi-universal language. A lot of big corporates have started to try to think about what they do, again, through an SDG lens. That will all have been sidelined by the crisis. So it's anybody's guess what that will look like. But it's been much more successful than the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded it, which I just had nothing like the same sort of cut through and global capture. I mean, obviously there are missing players in that. I think obviously President Trump doesn't talk a lot about the SDGs. Boris Johnson doesn't. You know, a lot of the sort of the leaders aren't that interested in it, but they have spread. Can I just make one comment on the global governance issues, which many of you have raised in the chat, and Miranda and Claire as well. I think we do have we have a whole set of problems in our institutions, which the WHO kind of exemplifies, in that it's both, it's surprisingly powerless relative to its national members. And it's not like it's a kind of wildly autonomous body going around bossing everyone, telling them what to do. It's almost the opposite. It's, you know, Secretary General is very weak. Cannot act against major funders, but also can't act really against its governing council. So in a way, we've got, you know, looking forward, there's only really sort of three ways you can organize your global bodies. Either you have them with all countries having a vote, which creates, you know, really sluggish ability to change, or you have small groups of countries, sort of, you know, which usually elite countries dominating them, like the Security Council or the World Bank or the IMF, which is deeply unfair if you're a poor country. And the only sort of, you know, long-run alternative, which doesn't exist yet, but I hope will in the future, is we create global institutions which have their own economic base, have a funding base in things like satellite orbits or the oceans, you know, other global commons, global resources, provide them with a degree of autonomy so they can operate and do the right thing on things like pandemics or climate change, whatever else it may be. And that's where I'd love the debate to shift, not into a completely sort of, I think, often misinformed debate about the WHO and what it did or what it didn't do, but towards what can we create genuinely global institutions which aren't so dependent on nation states, but equally aren't just run by a tiny handful of big powers, which at the moment is the only alternative.
Excellent. Claire, I'm going to bring you back in just for one final comment on this. We've talked a lot about developing nations in the context of the Caribbean. We've talked about the developing nations within the context of the USA. You've talked about the Afro-Caribbean community. You've talked about indigenous communities. Your chapter in, without giving it a huge plug, your chapter talks about a vision for a Pan-African vision. Africa's largely been left out of most people's conversation, as far as I can see, when they talk about the pandemic, but also what it looks like on the other side. What's your take there? I don't know to what extent you're looking at this, but do we need a different model for Africa to some of the other developing nations because of some of the inherent issues that were already stacked up before we got here? Is there a different path through this for them?
Yeah, I want to just say, yes, I would say there is. And on the question that Geoff raised about a new model going forward, right now, for example, with ocean data and space data, we know there's a space war happening as we speak. So while this was happening again, while our eyes were closed, the Great One went ahead and signed an executive order that basically gave one company the right to mine the moon, okay? Now, we have not yet worked out fully what that looks like. And so I'm very happy to see South-South cooperation happen, where, for example, Qatar is supporting countries in Africa, and we're seeing the beginnings, or we say the rapid buildup of conversations that were started with the Caribbean and Africa. We have been worrying about our existential threat. Some islands may not exist in 30 years. Where are we going to go for those islands? So Pacific countries and African countries were just part of the former ACP group, trying to formalize the relationship last year in a new organization, right? The Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. Those peoples live in diasporas in Europe and the US and Canada. And it was very painful to see, for example, a country like China repeating the history of the past 500 years and now abusing people in Africa, abusing Africans in China, for example. And so you're seeing like a turn on of a switch that was latent, and COVID basically creating new partnerships and new collaborations between these cells, these seeds of hope that have been happening in Ghana, which had this whole homecoming thing last year. And because you have so many Ghanaian doctors, Nigerian doctors in America, Caribbean doctors, they're already beginning to organize, okay, if the US government isn't going to help them, I'm going to help them how I can. So the nascent diaspora organizations, I think, if this works out the way we would like to see it work out, we'll be partnering with civil society on the ground in Africa, using the SDGs as a North Star, and trying to use our leverage here as citizens to find allies and partners who believe in this donut economic frameworks that says we need to look at a new model, and we as developed countries need to work differently and measure differently the rules that apply to Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, take into account their vulnerability, but at the same time, take into account the fact that the natural resource wealth that they have is there. And I do believe that with a different kind of model of investment, with the impact investment community having a lens that, hey, we need to change the world, there can be a third way, that there can be a way made from the impact investment partnerships with the diaspora and other people who see the world as different, who have always been seeds. I'm over there doing my stuff, but now I think I'm hoping to see, and certainly I'm hoping to help make happen a new arrangements of those groups that have always been women's movement here, the climate movement here, the race movement here, the justice movement here. I think we can see a new arrangement because of COVID that will create a new alliance of voices that will shift the balance between the China versus America dynamic, which we as little countries are struggling between. Who do we follow? Who do we follow? That can't work going forward.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. I knew you would have something provocative and powerful to say around that. And again, you can see from the comments that you're really touching a nerve with a lot of people. So I'm going to finish this little section with your polling question around the SDGs. Here's Claire's question around the future of the SDGs. I'm assuming that everyone pretty much knows what they are or has had a chance to look them up while we've been talking. A few people have tried to raise their hands for questions. Really, the best way to get your questions in is to put them in the Q&A and then have them be so compelling that they get upvoted. Okay, so nice competition between the top two options here I can see on my screen. Okay, let's share those results. So by far the most popular option, just over 50% of you are going for adjusting the targets to reflect a post-COVID world. Only 2 of you felt that we should just leave this to the countries themselves and get rid of the SDGs. I actually agree with Geoff. I think they've been a really powerful mechanism, and I'm incredibly impressed at how often before the lockdown you would go to conferences, and no matter what the topic, people would be talking about the SDGs as the framework through which they're running strategy choices, investment choices. And in particular, when you look at the sovereign wealth funds, how many of them are now using the SDGs as a framework to guide their impact investing, and moving from an almost stationary start where they were largely in government bonds and listed equities to suddenly moving to all sorts of private investment in things that can make a tangible benefit in the SDG area. So I think now is the time to kind of open up for a more general conversation. We've got some great questions going. I'd encourage the participants to have a look at the questions and see if there's any that you would like to see answered. But I'm going to put this first one out there because behind everything we've talked about so far, the changes, the kind of rebuilding of infrastructure, underpinning society going forwards, there is an issue of money. And George Davidescu has asked the question, how are governments supposed to support both healthcare costs, unemployment support, retirement pensions, economic stimuli, etc.? All these costs, and with a shrinking economy and thus less tax revenue, where is all the money going to come from? So Miranda, why don't you start? We haven't heard from you in a while. What's your take? How are we going to pay for all this? Or do we need to worry? Do we just keep printing it and create clever names for it like quantitative easing?
Yeah, that's definitely a big question, I would say. My first thought is right now we're in crisis mode. I don't think any government entity has really a full picture of how we're going to pay for it and what's going to happen. And I think the priority right now is to just make sure that people are not looting and people are not stealing and get some money in the pocket of others. I think going forward, this could have potential serious impacts on obviously taxation. I think aligning with the protectionism I discussed earlier, there could be an increase in tariffs on certain goods as well. On top of that, there might have to be a reevaluation of social services in the future. Maybe there will have to be adjustments to the pension plans and things like that. So I'm hoping that we'll see some innovative, governance and economic models coming out of this. But at this time, I don't know if there's a clear picture. And maybe Geoff has some more insight on that one as well.
Yeah, Geoff, I mean, from your perspective, what looks like an obvious candidate to get slashed as we pay for this, and where might we see some real innovation in how we fund the future? What are you hearing from all your government contacts about the way out of this financially?
Well, in some ways, the answer to the question is pretty simple, and it's the same answer you'd get if there was a war. The answer is debt. Countries go into debt, they borrow money when there's a crisis, and they pay it back after the crisis is over. And this has happened for millennia. As countries and governments, I say it's usually a war rather than a plague which causes this. Generalization then becomes very difficult because countries' starting points are so different. So in this country, the UK, for example, national debt actually isn't that high. So the sort of huge expansion of government borrowing which is happening at the moment is probably fairly sustainable. It'll be paid back over the next 10 or 20 years without anyone really noticing it. There won't be a need for huge choices as between higher taxes and cutting pensions and so on. Other countries have much more fragile public finances and much lower growth. And if you've only got prospect of 1% growth into the future, you've got a real problem. And then there's places like China, which has been happily with 7, 8, 9% growth a year for the last 20, 30 years. That has now collapsed. And they in some ways have a very overstretched banking system. So I would really warn against any generalizations on this topic. A lot of countries can weather this storm financially, really, even if it goes on for 2 years, they will not have that much difficulty in handling it, and government can borrow cheaply. So long as the economy grows, you can pay it back. Others will find it deeply, deeply traumatic. And the more poor the country, the more fragile the state, the weaker its tax base, the more there will be problems.
Two follow-up questions to that, and then I'm going to bring Clare in on the same questions. Firstly, where do we go for that debt? Given that every nation is struggling, do we look more and more to private wealth, the investment institutions, pension funds, do they become the providers of that debt, and what influence do they then have? And secondly, is this the kind of moment for a grand gesture for the IMF, World Bank, and the owners of debt to basically wipe out third world debt in the same way as the UK government has, wiped out NHS trust debt? Is there a kind of moment to just wipe the slate clean and start again?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah, and then we'll put the same question to Claire.
Well, in terms of, where does the money come from? Money is a very weird thing, which not many, is often not understood. Governments can create money, the banks create credit all the time, and indeed many of our problems have come from the ease with which money can be created by many institutions now without necessarily a foundation. Modern monetary theory, which has been much talked about for the last few years, which actually argues governments can create even more money than they thought they could. This is its moment in the sun, because essentially many governments are applying this many American body of ideas called modern monetary theory, which is almost the opposite of the old sort of monetarist idea, which said, you couldn't really create much money without an immediate effect on inflation. So in a way, sources of finance aren't necessarily that hard. The reason why I suspect the idea of a sort of a jubilee, a mass write-off of debt happening is unlikely is just that at the moment, and it's far too soon to say where we'll be in a year's time, this pandemic has hit the US far the hardest. It has the highest death toll, probably followed now by the UK, some quite rich European countries like Italy and Spain. So far, the effect on India has been dramatically less than was expected. The effect in sub-Saharan Africa has been dramatically less than feared so far. And so it would be slightly odd if that led then to a writing off of debt by cash-strapped countries like Italy and Spain for the rest of the world. Now, in a year's time, that might look completely different. I mean, it's possible this pandemic will, as people forecast a couple of months ago, have far more damaging effects in the south than in the north. And in that context, then I think there'll be a very strong case for a big write-off of debt, for a jubilee type action. But again, that would require political leadership. It would require probably a US president, a German chancellor, Japanese prime minister to be willing to do it, which in the current situation is unthinkable.
Claire, let's bring you in on this. So we have two questions being wrapped into one here, really. One is, how do we pay for it? And where does the money come from? And the second is, is this that moment for the grand jubilee gesture almost of wiping out the debt of third world nations?
Yeah, I've been thinking about how we pay for it. And I recognize that we're only 75 years into this grand global concept of countries working together and us seeing ourselves as one blue marble floating through space. But I would hope that now that we all are on the internet, most of us in the world are on the internet, and we do know that we float through space, that the military budgets that have been built up all around the world are proven to be useless right now, because at the end of the day, our common enemy is no longer going to be, I quote unquote, the big armies. Our common enemies are single threat, single state, sole person terrorism, and mosquitoes and viruses. Those are our threats, right? Realistically. So we may not need to build any new version of attack weapons, because our old ones can kill us off pretty well. So if we could probably split our military budgets for the next, let's say, 5 years, just a 5-year moratorium while we work this out, I think we'd get some money to help certainly pay for some of the things we have to spend here in the big countries. And then if you, let's say, let countries, even if you don't write off their debt, if you say, look, let's write off the next 5 years, and we pretend the next 5 years don't exist, and we skip over and start where we left off. So you don't have to be either all or nothing. It can be some way we hold it at exactly where it is, you pay nothing for 5 years, and you pick up back. So we have to rethink, totally reimagine what happens. And I believe if we can do that, both the developed countries will have some room in which to move, and emerging countries will have some space in which to breathe. And hopefully, if you relax now, some of the trade rules in terms of taxes they have to pay, some of the rules around banking restrictions for small countries and vulnerable countries, they can build up and continue to trade. We know again that tourism is going to be dead, and many countries in Africa and Caribbean and Pacific live off of that. So they have to have a way to earn their way. I don't think they want to be seen as beggars indefinitely. So if we can be allowed to grow our crops, sell our crops, and there's no undue hardship placed on us to do the things that we can do, I think we can work our way through this, but it has to be a collective thing. And one other thing, I think this idea of people's participation, the fact that we are now able to speak together, I'm wondering if it might not be time, rather than the poor governors of central banks making a decision all by their lonesome, might this not be a way for them to actually go to the people and say, hey, here are options, provide data. This is a good opportunity to do what Canada is trying to do and say, let's have a more transparent way of speaking. So if anything happens, I, the Prime Minister, don't get killed by myself because you all supported this idea, or I, the President. So I think that for rational thinkers, and I'm wondering if perhaps that's why this conversation, why women leaders seem to be doing better because they seek more consensus. I don't know. Perhaps now is the time for some countries who have disregarded the voice of women in leadership. They might want to bring some of the women they have been ignoring around the table, even if they're not in government, bring them around the table to have them decide exactly how do we make this work, because women are used to making that money stretch to feed the household.
Excellent, thank you, Claire. It kind of leads us nicely into one of the questions that we were debating before we were setting this up, and also we touched on in the kind of brief for this session, which is around power. Clearly, we're seeing winners and losers. Geoff, why don't you start us off on this, and I'll ask each of you to come in and just spend a minute or two reflecting on this. What is power going to look like in the next couple of years? Where is it going to reside? Who's going to have it? Geoff, why don't you start us off, and then we'll bring in Miranda and Claire for their thoughts on that.
I don't know. It's a short answer. And I think it's going to be messy and complicated. So, I mean, there's a few things we've seen already. So since the crisis started, the big platforms have become much richer and more powerful. Amazon, Zoom, you name it. Lots of small companies have become less powerful because they're bankrupt. We've seen government as a whole definitely become more powerful. And because in most societies, when there's a crisis, people defer more to authority and hierarchy. Most leaders have seen their ratings go up, and their sort of political capital has gone up, at least in the short term. We've seen, health systems, doctors become more powerful. Weirdly, scientists and experts have again seen their status rise because we've been reminded how much we depend on them. And fake news and so on isn't much help. But I think there'll be second and third and fourth order effects, which I find very hard to really predict what they'll be. I can offer an optimistic story, but there may be some dramatic ones. I mean, if China has a series of rebounds of the virus, that could dramatically change the legitimacy and power of President Xi and the Communist Party, with huge effects on the world. It could be, Donald Trump has already lost the next election, which has big effects on the rest of the world, or maybe we're completely misreading this. So, yeah, I'm a bit wary of anyone who thinks they know the answer to this and many other questions.
There's only perspectives at this stage.
No answer.
Miranda, you live in the world of finance. How are financial markets viewing power and its relationship to economies? What's the story there about how the balance of power will shift in our world?
That's a good question. I think one interesting story actually out of Africa is the fact that a lot of peer-to-peer payment apps are making their apps entirely free. And so I think throughout all of this, the financial institutions could become more powerful as more people find need for loans and find need for payment apps. Cash is going to become a lot less influential since people are scared to actually touch something somebody else just touched. So I do believe that kind of in the world of financial institutions, there will be a bit more power. However, to Geoff's point of more power to tech companies as well, these tech companies are encroaching in that space too. And I think that could also really drastically shift that center, that sphere of influence. And beyond the financial world, I agree with Geoff as well with the enhanced power of regulatory bodies. So right now, as we mentioned, the emergency power acts are in place, and these governments have more power right now. And I do believe there'll be some states that it doesn't end, or it doesn't end early enough, and there will be more control over citizens in that sense. The international bodies as well, like the WHO, I think is going to have a little bit of a challenge maintaining power in the next couple of years as they become the scapegoat. And I do think that there will be some influence on the world stage for countries that have responded, quote unquote, better to the crisis or have had a lower infection rate. I think that they'll be a bit more influential in the short term as to the respect they get from other countries, and there'll be more respect to the advice that they give as well. So those are some high-level thoughts, but yeah, I think it's impossible to predict, and I think it will. There will not be a clear path forward in this as well. I think it'll switch around quite a bit. Claire,
speak to us of power.
That's a good question. I mean, I am like Geoff, who knows? But I do think that the South move might really be the time for them to make their movies right now, I think. The fact of the matter is that Africa has sort of been a sleeping giant. And if they're allowed to, quote unquote, move unfettered, and if the leaders that are kind of shaping up, let's say in Rwanda is playing a major role in terms of being like a voice, Ethiopia is doing some very interesting things, Ghana, those three countries, so Ghana in the West, Rwanda there, and then Ethiopia, I'm seeing that their view of the world and the young people in the tech communities in Africa that are not willing to put up with or go back to certain ways of being might create a new vision for Africa that will allow Africa to say, wait a minute, it's our gold, it's our copper, it's our uranium, it's our oil, and couple that with the power of the let's say the companies that rule the world. I'm going to use that. The companies that govern the world, the companies that own most of the wealth in the world, wanting to remain in business and remain in power. I think we might see a shift there, a new partnership that might be very different from what we have expected. I have a hunch that certain oil companies want the price of oil to bounce back up. I have a hunch that since man in the moon is not that near, they will still want to get rare materials from Africa. And that's one reason why I think China is trying to put boots on the ground in Africa. But there's going to be a strong resistance right now from Africans with China taking up any more space in Africa. So it's not going to be what we thought where China would become the new power in Africa. There'll be a pushback and there'll be more distributed, let's say, balance. The dance will be much more delicate and exquisite, if you will.
Excellent, an exquisite and delicate dance. Well, so that let's share a polling question on this issue of global power. Let's get the participants back in. I've noticed a few people asking about will they get the slides and links. After the event, probably tomorrow, we'll send out an email to everyone who attended and also those who registered but didn't attend. We'll share the video link from the event. We'll share the contact details for all the speakers. We'll share the slides that you saw presented. We'll share the poll results. And we'll share various resources that the panel members have suggested you might want to follow up with. We'll also do a quick scan of the comments, and if there's anything in there that seems like a useful resource to share, rather than just blatant self-promotion, then we'll share those as well. Because we're nice like that. Okay. We've just gone over 100 results. So let's see, let's share the results. Most popular option here seems to be the one that will break up into rival power blocks centered on China, Europe, and the USA. Fascinating.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
The second vote, given what Claire's just been saying, is this idea that China becomes the new driving force for the global economy. Fascinating, fascinating views. Right, time to take, we got a little bit of time left. We're going to take a question that's been very popular with the participants from Alan Crowley. And this is a kind of more ground level question, really. What are the pros and cons of urban density and urban sprawl? And what are the aftershocks and opportunities for governance at this? Sorry, start again. Would you please address the pros and cons of urban density and urban sprawl, and what aftershocks and opportunities might be for governance at the city level post-pandemic? So what are the implications for city level governance of urban density or urban sprawl? Let's start with you, Miranda. Thoughts on what urban density might mean for us, or urban sprawl?
Yeah, it's interesting. For context, I live in a city that is incredibly sprawled out. And for the past couple of years, there have been extreme efforts to try to get a more urban, increase our urban density. And part of that is rooted in sustainability. So that desire to have people closer, less transportation, less land used up. On the flip side of that, COVID it's really illuminated how that might not be a good thing. So people are interacting with each other a lot more closely. If you live in an apartment, you're touching a lot of things other people are touching. On top of that, though, there's a desire now, or I think there will be a desire for a lot of people that live in apartments to get more space. Being cooped up in an apartment with, one bedroom and a roommate isn't what you're going to want next time you're under quarantine. And so I think that this is really going to drive people to want more houses space and yard space so that they can spread out and have the home office. So I think the trend of, urbanization and increasing urban density will actually decrease quite significantly. On top of that, if there are companies that are switching to work from home lifestyle, people that live in apartments don't necessarily want to do that because they don't have the physical space. And so if that becomes an increasing trend as well from COVID, I think we'll see more people in houses, which could drastically increase urban sprawl. The implications of that is revamped transportation lines. We're going to need to figure out better city transit, because our city at least has some issues with traffic because of our urban sprawl. And so our transit lines are not sufficient to handle even more increase in spread. I think in the future, beyond just COVID, there could, as transportation technologies evolve, potentially looking at Hyperloop and things like that, there could be almost suburbs in the countryside. So little areas of communities that are even more spread out because we can transport a lot quicker, that still provide the community and urbanization feel to people, but it's on a smaller scale. And with the increased spread and distance from these, there's less implications for land use and less implications for transportation as we improve that technology.
Thank you. Claire, what's your take on implications of all this for urban density and urban sprawl?
I'm going to take it from the point of view of developing countries, where I was in Ghana last year and certainly saw urban sprawl and lack of infrastructure. And I think there's going to be certainly a trend away from urban density. People have always, certainly in unplanned countries like Kingston, Jamaica, which is there's nowhere to sprawl to, so we have now spread out all across the island. I think urban density is going, the trend for them for building apartment buildings, I think will kind of slow down somewhat. People have been nervous because of this situation with living so close and being able to be self-sufficient in a city, for example. But I would think that the way to go back, there will not be the same traffic problems in the future in the same way we would have anticipated, because I think countries and people are going to get so used to this. Is going to last another year of staying home almost. So companies are not going to go back to, let's have everybody in the office and everybody has to drive into work at the same time. I think those days are done. I don't think it's coming back anytime soon. So thankfully for many countries, the traffic jam will be managed better. But to the extent that cities like New York, which already exist and which already have outgrown their boundaries, they will have to put in place certainly new laws, new thinking about the, let's say, healthcare management, The transit system, which certainly I think is one reason why I have all the deaths, because of the air, the whole air systems there, the engineering of those systems, I would say, will have to change a lot in the future for public health management. So I do think big cities like in New York or Tokyo, those very dense London, will have to rethink the engineering of the transit systems to make them safer for future passengers going forward.
Geoff, what's your take on the urban sprawl issue? Is it an issue?
So I hope Claire is right, and I hope there may be some lasting change in terms of the crisis effects on both sort of day-to-day travel, in work, as well as air travel. Again, I think the answers to this question depend very much where you are. If you're in Japan or Italy, where population overall is falling pretty sharply in the next 20, 30 years, you've got a very different set of issues from much of sub-Saharan Africa or Pakistan or Bangladesh. And here I think there's conflicting sort of pressures. So obviously a pandemic makes cities not fantastically great places. It's a reminder, a few centuries ago in London, I think 1 in 10 of the population died every year because the city was such an extraordinary generator of infection and had successive plagues. But it kept pulling people in because of economic opportunity. And the economic dynamic is still really strong, that if your city doubles in size, I think on average productivity goes up about 20%. That's why cities are still getting bigger. Against every prediction of the futurists. They all got this completely wrong. And this is all to do with the knowledge and creativity and dynamism effects of proximity, even in a digital era. Then, as Miranda said, the ecological pressure has also in some ways been towards higher density. There's certain kinds of high density cities requiring less energy, less transport, but also things like local food sourcing, which may be helped by the crisis, is easier in high density models. So yeah, it's a great question. I suspect the answers will be very varied. And Europe has high density models in sort of in houses without high rise. Other countries, Hong Kong has, I think, about the highest density in the world with incredible high rises, and then you have the typical US sprawl model. So the world has actually got lots of different ways of organizing cities, all of which will be able to take advantage of dramatically different technologies, from driverless cars to new energy systems, etc., etc. So yeah, a great topic, but again, one to probably avoid sweeping generalization. Though if I had to predict, it would be still that cities, the big cities, will be bigger in 20 years' time than they are now, pretty much everywhere.
It would be interesting to see what happens to that kind of blend between city centre activity and localised activity, with people having been in lockdown for 4 to 6 weeks, really only being able to shop locally. Will that have created a new habit? And will there be a desire to do more in your local community? And will that have an impact on, if you're in London, does that start to mark, a decline of big centres like the shopping centres like Westfield and Oxford Circus and things? Okay, we are coming towards the end. We're going to take one final polling question, and then I'm going to give the panelists their chance to give us final thoughts, and then we are going to send everyone home. Okay, so the final question is really about your confidence and your country's ability to deliver effective, responsive and forward-looking government and governance in the next 2 to 5 years. So you're answering from a very local perspective. I say after the event, we will send out pretty much everything you've heard about, the video link, the resources, so you can follow up as well with the individual panel members. Okay, let's share the results of the polling. Oh, that's kind of optimistic. We probably have, the biggest single group are in the somewhat confident but then there's about 42% who are down there unconfident about their own government. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years. So let us now take the final views from each of the panelists. Let's give you each a minute. I think we've got about a minute each, roughly. And that's a real minute. Let's start with you, Miranda. 1 minute on your final reflections on post-pandemic government and governance.
Oh, 1 minute. I think my final reflections are, I'm glad we're discussing this. I don't think there's a clear path forward for any nation, and every nation is in a very unique position and challenging position as well in regards to prioritizing public health and prioritizing economic well-being as well, and how do those interplay. And I think the more we talk and the more we discuss the potential outcomes, the more we can build towards what we want and the hopefully optimistic future that's to come. So yeah.
Excellent. Claire. No, actually, let's go to you, Geoff. We'll finish on Claire.
Well, maybe just one thing really to say. So I think we've been reminded of something which should be very obvious and very simple, which we'd forgotten. For the last 30 or 40 years, lots of the sort of futurology profession, the sort of airport paperbacks, entrepreneurs and others have said government is withering away, it's no longer necessary, it's been replaced by technology or the market, and it's kind of a thing of the past, and the quicker we can kill it, the better. We've been dramatically reminded that we need government. There is no other institution which can protect us against risks we can't handle on our own, and certainly none which can do that fairly. So we've been reminded of, as for 5,000 years, why government is essential to our lives and our security. And the big issue now is how we help governments use that power well, accountably, with transparency, rather than using this surge in their power in ways which in the end harm us.
Claire, final thoughts.
I am going to err on the side of optimism and say that unlike some people who believe that humans are really selfish, scientists have proven that people actually are very selfless, and that people's tendency, and science has proven that if people actually share more and give more, there's actually a better outcome for themselves. So because that is now a scientific study has been done and people are talking about that, we're going to see a goodwill come up that allows government then to err on the side of people first. We have seen here in America the market first response, but I think at the local level we've seen people first. And if we continue putting people first at the local level, given that all government is local, but our global level is built up of localities, millions of localities, we're going to see a global governance structure that begins to look towards how do we thrive in a world where the climate change is still a threat, where the virus sphere will remain a threat, at the same time become fully human. I do believe that we are still going to trend upwards as humanity.
Thank you. Well, let me just share my final thoughts. I think we've been going through a period over the last decade at least where people had kind of detached from government and governance. They just sort of assumed that governments would get on with things, they would get on with their own lives. We got very wrapped up in our day-to-day, our pursuit of whatever it is we were going after. And I think the pandemic has really been a wake-up call for people. They suddenly realize how important government is. They're the only people they can rely on to deliver the testing, the healthcare, the civic protection, the organization of society to make sure that everyone isn't out on the streets. And suddenly we've become aware again of how important government and governance is. So my big hope is that coming out of this, people are much more attentive to government, much more willing to use their voice, much more willing to use their vote if they have one, but much more willing to engage in all forms of citizen activity. I want to thank everyone for taking part. Firstly, the panelists for sharing so generously of your thoughts and ideas. I want to thank the participants for sharing incredible questions and comments, and just leave you with a couple of things. All three of the panel members you see here today are contributors to this forthcoming book. They've talked a little bit about the topics they've talked about in the book, but they've expanded on them in many different ways. and in fascinating ways. And we're going to have a series of webinars. This is our 4th. We're having a break next week, just while we finalise the book. Then we'll go back on the road again from the 2nd week of May, and we'll bring in more of the contributors to the book, because there are some incredible ideas in there. One of the more interesting things we've learnt about as a publisher in the pandemic is that Amazon refused to publish anything with the words coronavirus or COVID-19 in them, in case they get sued for giving medical advice, which, when you've had 113 chapter contributions, all of which mention those terms at least 4 or 5 times each, suddenly creates a fascinating editorial challenge. And the other thing is, just as a little giveaway, thank you all for coming. We do run these things for free. We may not do it forever, but we also like to kind of share our content very widely. So if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, get your camera out, take a picture of the screen. You can go to our website and sign up for the newsletter for free. And we're also offering a 25% discount on our books, because somehow we have to feed the Talwar children in a lockdown. So thank you all for coming. If I could ask the panelists to hang around, and see you all on the next webinar in a couple of weeks' time. Goodbye. Well, you guys were incredibly popular. The number of times I saw people saying they bought your book, Geoff, or that Claire, they wanted to find out who you were, or Miranda, they loved your comments. I think you did a fantastic job. I think it was a really, really rich set of ideas, and kept moving at speed as well, which I thought was great. We covered a lot of territory, some of which I'm not sure any of you were expecting, but you did a fantastic job of still making a good start.
Geoff, what's the name of your book again?
You're muted, Geoff. Maybe I can unmute you.
The one I was shamelessly promoting is called Big Mind.
Okay.
You might also be interested in the thing, actually, I published a few weeks ago on SDGs, and a new approach on applying it to SDGs come out of work I've been doing with the UN. I can send you a link to that.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in that, because that's one of my pets. I worked at Inter-American Development Bank, I think I told you, for 30 years. So I'm very much into trying to get people to see why it matters to them personally. So every speech I do, I talk about it from the point of view of the people in the room. So I don't care if you work on water, education, health, if you're a private sector company, it really has to do with how do we create a shared future where more people thrive.
Yeah.
Because there's no point in you having all this wealth, but you're afraid to go from your car to your house because a gunman might attack you on the sidewalk. It doesn't make sense. What kind of life is that? So let's just all ease up a bit. And I think that I'd love to find out how you think this big mind, the collective intelligence, would support certainly governments working more intelligently.
We'll put a link to the book in the follow-up email as well, Geoff.
Yeah, okay.
If that piece of work on the SDGs, if you could send me a link, just while it's fresh in your mind, I'll also put that in. Claire, did you send me any links to share or anything? I can't remember if you did or not.
No, I didn't.
Is there anything you want to share on any of the topics you talked about? Because there were so many beautifully kind of insightful people.
I have actually, I'll send you a link of a video I did with some people on healthcare in Africa, healthcare futures in Africa.
All right, and then any other things that you talked about, just any of that stuff about the diaspora or anything?
Because the diaspora people were speaking about what they plan on doing.
If you could send those to me in the kind of next hour or so, that'd be brilliant, because then we can get this out tomorrow morning.
Okay, excellent.
So there's still a bunch of people logged in, but I think those are people who just like have this on while they're working in the background and they're off making tea. Can we just go around and get any feedback from you? Our goal is to always try and make these things better. So if we can just quickly go around and get any feedback, that would be great.
I was got to join something at 3, unfortunately. Okay. I'm going to have to leave, but I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Geoff.
You both. Yeah. All right.
Cheers. Miranda.
I thought it was good. Yeah. Yeah.
Anything we can improve?
Honestly, no. I think it
Okay.
was pretty well done. Yeah. I felt like there was enough time to prepare myself, and the previous call with you was really useful to flesh out kind of the ideas.
Right.
So,
Thank you. Claire.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed it. And I think certainly having the balance in terms of Geoff being a government person, very much working in that space and have worked in that space, Miranda from the private sector, and myself speaking as a regular person who's looking at it from the outside at this point, because I've been out of the system for like 10 years. So I basically just say what I want to say, do what I want to do. Nobody's going to say anything if I say it. Was a good balance in terms of workshops like this. So you really get people touching different people's mindset.
And your energy really came across. I think people like that you were, you got more and more passionate about certain topics, and that really came across. And I think that, it's quite a cerebral audience. If I look at who signed up, there's a lot of futurists and analysts and people who kind of take themselves very seriously. And actually you saw that you woke a lot of them up. You made them think in a very different way about stuff that they only look at through a data filter.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the mistake.
Yeah.
Because if you don't allow if you look at, yes, I'm an engineer on one side of my brain, but the other side of my brain, which is like the artsy side, I have to, and that's the thing what's wrong with development in general. I worked in the space for 30 years and I was always at odds with everybody because I had to be looking at, okay, the data says this, but this is what is on the street. So how can you design better systems? So I really do believe that as tragic as we find ourselves, position we find ourselves in, thank God we have internet, you know what I mean? That's a good side of it. I spoke to my colleague who actually is one of the holders of the key. There's 7 people who hold the keys to the internet, and I plan to interview him soon, right? Because my big question is, what happens if it breaks? Everybody's on it now all the time. I want to be reassured. Other people want to be reassured that you guys know what you're doing, So I think that, because of where we are with technology, we actually can get out of this. But the things that many governments and the people in politics don't know, because they're mostly lawyers. They don't have a lot of scientists in governments, unfortunately. So thank God the scientists are getting more respect. Technology getting more respect. So hopefully their vision of the future can bleed through.
Well, thank you both. It's been fantastic. I really appreciate you giving up the time, the comments, getting up so early. It's been fantastic and well worth it. You could see from the comments that people were just loving it. So are
we gonna get that as well? So we're gonna get a copy of the.
I will send you. I'll send the panelists a list of who attended, so just you can see. I'll send you the comments and the Q&A as well, so you can see all of that. Just for your own interest.
And the recording is posted, right? So
the recording will be posted afterwards. Zoom send it to me shortly afterwards.
Okay, excellent.
And then we'll send that link out, and so I'll send you guys a little email with all the stuff in it for you, and then there'll be a broader email that goes to all the people with all those links you shared. We'll copy you in on that as well.
Okay, awesome. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.